Hello, everyone. We are getting towards the end of the year here, and as we've been looking back, we've thought, this has certainly been an interesting year. In fact, it's been one of the more interesting years that we've covered in quite some time. Here to discuss that with me today is Abby,
Hello.
Richard,
Hey.
and Dale.
Greetings.
I think one thing I want to lay the groundwork for is that when we say interesting or most interesting, that does not necessarily mean best or that every camera released has been good. You know, there have been a lot of really good cameras. You've got the Panasonic S1 II, the Sony A7 IV, and the Canon EOS R6. But those were mostly what you would have expected. But we also saw manufacturers kind of throwing wild things at the wall that were very far from sort of the normal camera that we would expect to see from them. And I think, Richard, you had a really interesting insight as to why that may be.
Yeah, I might be wrong, but I had a look at the numbers, and in 2024, the industry shipped around 6.5 million interchangeable lens cameras, which is a solid number, but is around 50% as many as they sold in 2010, which was the peak of the market. And then if you look at fixed lens cameras, and there's been talk of there being a resurgence of interest in compacts. Fixed lens cameras sold around 1.9 million cameras in 2024, which is 98% down on the 2010 figure. It's 2% as many cameras were sold. Fixed lens cameras were sold last year as at the market's peak. Quite simply, there's not, none of these manufacturers can just keep doing things the way they've been doing them. All of them are casting around to find new audiences and new markets. And that has meant there have been some really peculiar launches and some really fun launches in really interesting ways. So, I think it almost feels like looking back on those very early days of digital cameras when no one was quite sure what a digital camera should be or who it would be for, and people were just trying things. And so last year saw some really unexpected and niche offerings. Alongside, as you say, some very, some really obvious mainstream cameras that do lots of things really, really well. Our camera of the year, Nikon Z5 II, just is going to be enough camera for almost everybody, and it's sensibly priced, and it's it offers lots of capability, but it is very sensible. A lot of the cameras we saw last year were not sensible. They were weird, niche, just strange choices, and I'm here for it.
The compact market has been sort of hit substantially harder than the ILC market. So I think that is probably the space where we've seen maybe the most tries to find something that works. Perhaps one of the more straightforward ones this year, though still quite different than what the normal person thinks of when they think of a compact, would be the Sony RX1R3.
Yeah, I think it is nothing if not niche. It's a full frame fixed focal length camera is already niche. If you then put a $5,000 plus price tag on it, then you really narrow down the audience significantly. On paper, it should have been a nice sensible play, because the RX1, this is now the fourth, weirdly, entry in the RX1 series, and it's a series that has built up quite a solid fan base. People have been hoping for and asking for a replacement for years. I'm sort of surprised Sony did it. I always saw it as being almost a halo product, just to sort of signal, send out, we understand camera vibes. I didn't, the degree to which people actually were expected to buy them is a little bit, unclear. But they did buy them and they did love them. And now here's the fourth version. It's got an excellent sensor. It's got much improved autofocus. It's much quicker than the previous versions. It's got a bigger battery. It's addressed all the things that people was concerned about. And the internet lost its mind over the camera and insists it's terrible. It isn't terrible. It's lovely. It is just so expensive. Like the price really makes it impossible to talk sensibly about the camera, but it is supremely niche. It is it makes no sense. If you look at the rest of Sony's lineup, you can see exactly who they're aimed at, and you look at this one and you just go, "It's Richard, isn't it?" You're really hoping Richard's going to buy one because the market is probably going to be that small. But for those people who do really want the most image quality out of the smallest package and like 35mm lenses, it's fabulous. But yeah, judge it by sensible metrics, or even think rationally about the price for a second, and it makes no sense.
I think a lot of that kind of applies to the GFX100RF as well. Quite expensive, astounding amounts of image quality in good light. Because of that medium format sensor, which of course makes it a little bit less compact than the RX1R. But it is very much a camera designed for a very specific audience, people who look at it and go, wow, I love the look of that. It's got a very sort of, I think you called it Instax inspired look, but like in the best way possible. Instax cameras are mostly designed to a price. This one is, well, what if we spared no expense? They milled the top plates out of aluminum, which they were actually very proud of until a camera launched right before that kind of stole the thunder on that. We'll get to that one. They told me, oh, we're so excited to announce this the first camera made out of milled aluminum. Oh wait, but it has just a lot of decisions that make you think this is really designed for a specific audience. Half of the back of the camera, not half of the back of the camera, but a big chunk of the back of the camera is taken up by a dial that cannot be reassigned to change the aspect ratio of your JPEGs. And I know, like they were looking at I think David Amell specifically, and were like, he will really like this, and I think he ended up doing so. It's just such a interesting swing for the fences from Fujifilm, when they could have basically made a Super X100 6 with the 35mm lens and call it a day. But that's not really what we got.
It's going to be fascinating to see whether that camera finds its audience, or whether it's a camera that's destined in 5 to 10 years time to turn up in a load of Instagram reels or whatever fresh hell has been introduced by that point, going, have you ever heard of this camera? Well, it did, it can go one of two ways. It's either going to be an out and out classic that everyone remembers and everyone loves, or it's going to be a forgotten classic, in the same way as the Epson rangefinder, the RD1, I think, that every now and again, its sole role in life at this point seems to be to turn up on Instagram to go, hey, I bet you've never heard of this camera. It's like, well, actually, I've kind of been doing this a while. I'm afraid I have.
Is that the one with the dials that look like pressure gauges on some sort of industrial equipment?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
6 megapixel CCD off the top of my head. But yeah, it's I've no idea if there is an audience for the GFX100RF. I really hope so. And I that's kind of my feeling about all of these cameras. They're not all of them are aimed at me. They're aimed at weird little niches that may or may not exist. But I really hope they do, because within DPReview and within our audience, I've seen people for years going, why doesn't anyone do anything interesting? Why doesn't anyone make a camera for me? Well, it almost feels like the industry is going to try and make a camera for you on an almost individual level. Whatever your mad hopes and dreams that a camera should have, someone's going to make one. But it's been very strange to see the reaction from other people that go, well, that's not quite what I wanted. It should have this, it should have that. It's like, well, it sounds like you're describing cameras that already exist. And they already exist, so you could get one of those. So, yeah, it's very strange having to review a really niche camera, especially if you're not within the target niche. Actually, sometimes if you are in the target niche, because it's hard to get a sense of perspective, RX1R3. On which note, if you think the RX1R3 is niche with its very sort of limited feature set and spectacular price, let me introduce the Leica Q3 monochrome, which is, a very fixed, it's a fixed lens, fixed focal length, full frame camera at an even more fabulous price that can't shoot color. And yet it is really good. I joked in the article that its appeal is so niche that I suspect Leica is already on first name terms with everyone who's going to buy one. I don't think I'm exaggerating that much, but if you are one of the people who wants this camera, I'm really glad it exists for you.
Truly the Birkin of cameras, the Leica Q3 monochrome, in a lot of ways, actually. Yeah, I agree that camera, probably, they'll sell a dozen of them or so, maybe a little bit more than that. But I think everyone who sees that camera knows exactly who it's for and what it's about. There were some cameras, I think, this year that were a bit more misunderstood, that were so far out there that a lot of people kind of had a hard time wrapping their minds around them. For the epitome of that, I say maybe would be the Sigma BF, which I know, Dale, you were there for the launch of.
Yeah, the Sigma BF, I have to say, Richard and I were there for the launch of it in Aizu, Japan, and it was one of the more interesting camera launches that I've ever experienced. And the thing about Sigma is I don't think anyone would ever argue that Sigma doesn't have a history of making cameras that are different or unique or interesting. They definitely do, whether it's the foveon sensor or the weird shapes that they've done. They've always tried to do something out of the box. And I think that aligns with Mr. Yamaki, the CEO of Sigma, his entire philosophy of making products that are unique. And certainly a lot of Sigma products are very unique when it comes to cameras. We weren't sure what to expect, honestly, when we got to the event. And I know Richard has told this story a couple times before, but shortly before the event, Sigma actually gave us the specs of the camera on the sly so that we could get it into our articles and have it ready to go when the launch was actually announced. And on paper, it kind of looked like the Sigma FP Mark II. There wasn't really anything remarkable about it. And I think that's actually a lesson in how different a spec sheet can look and how different the end product can be. And that you can't necessarily tell what a product is from the spec sheet. I think the Sigma BF is potentially a very misunderstood camera, because one of the things I've seen is I've seen a lot of people talk about it in the context of its specs and its performance. I've seen a lot of reviews about it that review it as if it's a different product than what it really is. And it's a product that's very focused on experience, and not just experience, but trying some new things. And I think this is where Sigma really got the BF right, is they've tried some things that work really well. So, we all know the body is milled out of a solid block of metal, but they did some other things beyond just that thing that you see in the pictures. And one of them really jumps to mind is the menu system on that camera. Yeah, it's really easy just to slap in the same menu system that all of your other cameras have. It's certainly the least expensive approach. And as soon as you pick up that camera, one of the things that you realize is somebody took a lot of time to really start from the ground up and think, what should be in a camera menu? Maybe it doesn't need to be everything, but maybe the things that you really need to use right when you're in the middle of shooting and you need to access a setting should be front and center and just really jump out at you and be very easy to access. And they managed to do that. It's a really elegant menu system, and I'd love to see that philosophy move to other cameras. They also did some things like the buttons. They're actually not buttons. If you think about a smartphone, when you click on the screen and it taps back at you, there's no buttons there. That's haptic feedback. And the Sigma BF does the same thing. Those buttons on the Sigma BF, if you turn off the power, they don't do anything. They're just bumps of metal. As soon as you turn the power on, it feels like they're clicking. That's a really unique implementation, and I think it could have some really interesting connotations for things like weather sealing on cameras. So that's an interesting technology they developed. I mean, even the body cap on the Sigma BF is a beautiful camera. But I think the reason it's misunderstood is people are judging it based on what they want it to be or what they expect it to be and not what it is. And what it really is more of a lifestyle product than anything. Mr. Yamaki actually told us this is the camera that if you're going to go to a bar or a restaurant and you want to take some social photos, this is a beautiful camera that you can take with you. You can enjoy having it, you can enjoy experiencing it, and you can enjoy shooting with it. And then it looks good when you set it down on the bar next to you. And yeah, there's a certain, maybe vision to that not everyone appreciates. But I understand where Mr. Yamaki is coming from. And I think in that context, it does actually achieve those things. The one thing that I think is really useful to call out about the Sigma BF, and they completely buried the lead on this, I don't even think they mentioned it in the product announcement, is this is a camera that has an HDR workflow. The photos that come out of this camera are by default HDR photos. If you put them on a screen that displays HDR, you see beautiful HDR photos. And I don't think it was until later when we asked them about it. Richard, you can probably tell the story, but I think you noticed something interesting about the photos, and you asked Mr. Yamaki about it. And I recall him responding, oh yeah, it does do that too. And I feel like they completely buried the lead on that camera. But is it unique? Yeah, absolutely. Is it for everybody? Absolutely not. Does it do things the way that Sigma does it, doing it its own way with its own vision to make a unique product? Yeah, it definitely does. And I think it gets an awful lot right in the process.
We asked, we noticed that the camera was very keen on using ISO 400. It wasn't its base ISO, but its program line was very, very heavily biased towards using higher ISOs, or more to the point, reducing the exposure at all times, i.e. capturing more highlights. So it turns out it was exposing all the time to capture additional highlights. And the response we got from Mr. Yamaki at the time was, I believe it's something to do with the highlights, making the highlights look more attractive. It was actually Mitchell who spotted, as we were working our way through the review, because he has a fancier Mac than I do, he opened some of the JPEGs on his computer and just went, hang on,
what's going on here?
And yeah, it was a completely undocumented feature. A couple of months later, Hasselblad would introduce a camera whose main selling point is the fact that it does true HDR images at all times. It's helped by having an HDR ready screen, but I think that just goes to show what's going on in the Sigma. They've started from a blank piece of paper and just gone, actually, if you were designing a new camera and you had no idea how cameras are supposed to work, what would, a photo-taking device, what would it look like? And, it absolutely isn't the answer to everyone's question. In fact, its user interface is perfect for a very specific type of photo. It is not going to, this is not the way all cameras should work in the future. It's not for everybody. But the idea of the main display being a preview of the shot you're about to take, and then you having a little separate settings sub-display that tells you, what your aperture is, or what your shutter speed is, or what your ISO is. So you're not, you don't have a screen full of icons. You don't have to press the display button to cycle through whether you want, 18 icons, some of which you've remembered the meaning of, versus, actually, I want a clear display. It's just designed to let you preview, what is my photo going to be? How am I going to compose this? And it pushes just the important settings off to one side and says, okay, get your settings right, but worry about the photo. It's just such a different way of doing things. It is niche. It's not perfect. It's not applicable to lots of photography, but it's got a level of attention to detail and innovation unlike anything I've seen in a very, very long time. And it's quite unlike, I've seen people draw comparisons to the Leica TL, and they were trying to do something similar, and milled aluminium body, etc., etc. But even then, the Leica TL's interface was nothing like as clean or well honed as the Sigma BF. So it's part of it is we're camera reviewers. We review an awful lot of cameras that all work the same. But we've been asking for years, actually, could someone look at, is this the way a camera should operate? And it's really exciting to see someone create a camera that is so considered about, okay, what at its base what matters about photography. So yeah, it's mad, it's niche, I've no idea if anyone's going to buy one, but it is a lot more than just, oh, it's a Sigma FP or Panasonic S9 in a solid lump of metal. It is so much more than that.
Mr. Yamanki told us the story about the inspiration for the design philosophy behind this. It's a story about seeing in an exhibit a old bottle of Chanel No. 5 perfume and thinking to himself, the simplicity and the elegance in getting the job done and really focusing on that product was one of the things that inspired him. And so when he gave his engineers a directive to go forth and design this thing, he didn't tell them how to design it, but he shared that philosophy. And I think they actually achieved that to a great degree. They created a product that in its simplest form is very elegant, very simple. It doesn't have more controls than it needs to have. If you need 3 dials and a whole bunch of buttons and things, there are cameras out there that do that. But this is very much a camera that, as you said, Richard, it's about really focusing on the photographic experience, on taking the photo. And it's very minimalist in that sense. And it basically puts those tools that you really need to have in front of you, easy to access and right there, and really not much else. And it does so in a really elegant, well thought out way.
I have a lot of friends that are they're in the human factors department at the school that my husband teaches at, and so they study ergonomics and how people interact with technology and all sorts of things like that. I think some of them have worked with camera and phone companies before, helping them establish things and kind of research how different stuff works. But I would really be curious to see how what they think of the BF. You say that the menu system is kind of a niche setup, or that the display is a niche setup, but I don't know if it maybe should be that niche. I think there are really good things about it that should be more mainstream. I think, it's not going to be ideal for sports photography or kind of these high-end types of photography that have super specific requirements. But for the general consumer, the person that's just going out there and taking photos for fun, I think the way that the Sigma BF handles those things is maybe the better way.
I suspect if your goal is to get new people into photography, if you pick up like a Canon or a Nikon, there's a lot of information that you have to learn really quickly before you can, start taking photographs. And I think the Sigma BF there will be a learning curve, but it's much closer to sort of the experience that you get with your phone, while still giving you a lot of control that your phone doesn't. So I think you've got a good point there. Now, I don't think that was the most beginner photographer friendly camera that we saw this year. I think there was one other one that was. I don't think Sigma designed this for someone who's like not necessarily who isn't like sort of well versed in the photographic art. I think they probably designed it for people who do know about photography but maybe don't consider themselves to be a photographer. The camera that I think was designed for people who are like maybe just buying their first camera would be the Fujifilm X-Half, which may be the maddest of them all.
Yeah, I think at the beginning of this video, I talked about the fact that compact camera sales have, or the number of compact cameras sold has dropped 98% since 2010. But that said, fixed lens camera sales are up 26% year on year, from a very, very low base. But they are growing, and a lot of camera manufacturers have said, we do recognize there's demand for compact cameras. But a lot of that demand at the moment is being satisfied by people buying old, often not very good compact cameras on eBay at incredibly inflated prices for cameras that are probably 12 months away from failing completely. There's an entire subreddit, essentially, it doesn't realize it, but r/cameras, a large chunk of that is dedicated to, I've bought an old camera, it's failed, what do I do? And the answer is try and find another one. Fujifilm is the first and so far only manufacturer we've seen trying to make a camera for this younger generation, for whom the very idea of having a dedicated camera is itself an act of sort of nostalgia, is and an attempt to do something creative away from what their smartphone does. And the X-Half is the maddest possible response to that. I don't dislike it. I don't think it works. But I do recognise that I am at least 20 years too old to actually really have a proper opinion on it. Abby, as somebody who isn't as monstrously out of touch, what did you make of the X-Half?
I don't know if I'm that much more in touch, but that's a story for another day. But so I didn't get a chance to use the X-Half, full disclosure. So I was looking at it from afar, but when I first saw the specs, I have to admit I was really disappointed. I was not enthused by it. But as I started thinking about it, I really like that Fujifilm did something drastically different. I think we have so many really good cameras. I mean, even beginner cameras these days are quite frankly really good, and a lot of camera for what people need. And so to see something that took a drastically different approach, not the same approach that the Sigma BF did, but a drastically different approach, I think it was really refreshing. And it's a camera that is meant to be fun. That's the whole point of the camera. It's meant to be fun. And I think it's really easy for people that are into the technology side of photography and into the latest tech and things like that to forget that photography can and maybe should be fun. When you are constantly seeking the newest and greatest cameras, that kind of can get lost in translation and get forgotten about. And so I like that Fujifilm released this camera that is meant to be fun and playful. Did they do a great job of it? I don't know. Image quality isn't great. There's quirks about it that don't work well. You guys said the autofocus is terrible. There's all these things that don't work well about it, but I do really think it's nice to have a fun camera.
Yeah, I mean, in your answer to, did Fujifilm get it right? No, they didn't. No, they didn't. It is kind of slow, and you get surprisingly little image quality for such a good sensor. But it is small and it is delightful, and it's got a wind-on lever for no obvious reason. And you can get it to pretend to be a film camera and not let you see your photos. I mean, it is very silly. It is very good fun, and it's almost brilliant. But it's also 2025, so it's also too expensive.
Right. My hope is that Fujifilm eventually comes out with a second iteration that is the nice version of it. I think that's unrealistic. I don't know if they'll make a duplicate of this, but in my dream world, they would have a refined version of it.
They'll call it the other half.
I was going to say X3/4, but that doesn't work because it's pretending to be a half frame camera because, of course, all of us remember what half frame cameras were, right?
I just shot with one last year, so yes.
Yeah, but it shoots vertically, right? By default.
It does.
And I'm not sure that's a bad decision if the people they're trying to attract are folks that might be coming from a smartphone and are looking to experiment with a dedicated camera. I think it's something that the generation that's buying, or probably that camera's targeted at, are very comfortable with, is a vertical way of shooting.
Absolutely. No, it makes an awful lot of sense. But I can't help but notice that when I think it was the Pentax 17, because Pentax made a genuine half frame film camera a couple of years ago, and I remember one of the other websites in our space sort of said, had an interview where they said, "Oh yeah, no, I hadn't twigged that meant that the photos would be vertical." And he says, "Well, hang on, that was written by somebody older than me. And if you don't remember that's how half frame photography works, how many of the potential audience of the X-Half do?"
Yeah, but you could say that with the film simulation dial too. Like, most of the people buying this camera are not going to inherently know what any of those mean. So I think that's true of multiple factors on this camera.
That's true, and actually, I'm of a generation where I did shoot film a bit while it was still the dominant format. I predate digital somewhat. I don't know. I don't have a strong sense of what a lot of those film formats look like. Essentially, they are just memorable names for, oh yeah, that color response. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that basically these are, a lot of the X-Half is nostalgia for a world that you don't really understand, if it ever existed at all. It's not trying to be a film camera. It's trying to be a mad pastiche of a film camera for people who've never shot film. And that's not the thing it gets wrong. That's the thing it gets right.
To translate for a younger audience, the X-Half is not low-key goated. In fact, it's a little chopped, but they are cooking.
I need a translation of that.
I suddenly feel so much older.
I really hope that bit comes with subtitles.
Anyway, you can delete that if you think it's too embarrassing for me. But so I think we've covered sort of pretty well what an interesting year it's been for cameras, but sort of the other half of the equation, not for most of these cameras, funnily enough, is the lenses that are available for them. And I would argue that it has been just as interesting a year in lenses, because you've had sort of the mainline types of lenses. There's been a lot of interesting releases there. You know, Nikon had their 24-70 f2.8 S2, which is the first of that kind of lens that we've seen that is internally zooming rather than extending. And that let them make it lighter, smaller in some ways, and more weather resistant. We also saw Hasselblad come out with a very similar lens, but for medium format. I believe you've used that, right, Abby?
I have. I've been using it for a couple weeks now, I think it's been. And it is kind of wild because usually medium format, the camera's going to be bigger and you're going to get a gigantic lens as well. And it really, I mean, it's big, don't get me wrong, but it's not that outrageous. I took the camera with that lens on a hike and did not hate my life. So I think it's pretty surprising that they were able to pack all of that, and the image quality is really good. I mean, I'm not looking at it from a like clinical perspective or studio perspective, but in terms of what I was able to shoot with it, and obviously what you're seeing on a 100 megapixel sensor, I think it looked really nice. It was a reasonably fast aperture. It's not groundbreaking, but reasonably fast, and so it pairs really well with the camera, and it, like I said, it's surprisingly compact and lightweight for what you're getting out of it.
I think when we were shooting with it and the X2D2, Richard, you were shooting a Z5 II with the first generation Nikon 24-70, and we kind of looked at them next to each other and were like, huh, those are pretty similar in size and weight for the fact that one of these is a medium format camera and one of them is not.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure that there are going to be some people going, well, it's not really medium format, is it? Well, you know, it's still a sensor that's 75% bigger than full frame, and so, you know, you'd expect the lens to have to be much bigger. And the fact that they've managed to make an f2.8 to 4, and I can't work out what that is in terms of equivalence because I can't do 0.7. I
believe it's 2 to 3.2.
That sounds about right. You know, this is, in practical terms, a really quick lens. It's using digital corrections, of course, but it's really sharp. It's really fast to focus. It suddenly makes, you know, the promise of that system, which was, hey, look, it's medium format, but it's a small camera, you know, that you can take out of the studio. Well, now all of a sudden, versus the Mark 1, the latest versions are image stabilized, and the batteries last a decent amount of time, and that lens is remarkable. You know, I think I said in the review that I wouldn't choose that. You know, that camera was not best suited to travel photography. Lots of people complained and said, you totally can use it for travel photography. Like, yeah, you can. You know, and I just got back from the UK. I'd spent 2 weeks lugging that thing around. I'm really glad I did. I got some great photos. You absolutely can use it for travel photography, but it is still one of the bigger and heavier options that you could choose. So I wouldn't say that is its number one strength. But that lens adds so much flexibility. It really works, and it makes that system, it gives that system a level of performance that's much, much closer to, you know, a mainstream full frame camera.
And in a similar vein, we saw Nikon release a 16 to 50 f2.8 for its APS-C cameras. I guess in a similar vein, going the other way. But that is sort of the lens that we would have all wanted for that system. You know, a good standard zoom that's relatively fast, and that they hadn't made before for their mirrorless systems. And hey, now we have it. And more importantly, haven't let anyone else make for their mirrorless systems. But then Sigma was like, oh, you thought that was interesting. Why don't we make a 17 to 40 f1.8 for APS-C? Not for Nikon. It's the only one that didn't get it, but that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I had on my bingo card for this year that Sigma would revive one of my favorite lenses they've ever produced, which is an updated version of the old 18 to 35 f1.8, which was a magnificently ambitious lens for APS-C DSLRs, and that turned out to be a massive pain to focus. So anyone who's grown up using mirrorless, and we're now getting to the stage where there are plenty of people who would have primarily used mirrorless, won't remember how much less reliable off-center AF points were on DSLRs. The center point could focus it quite well, but as soon as you drifted away from the center, your hit rate went down significantly, particularly with that lens. So to get a revived version of that lens that really helps you squeeze the most image quality out of an APS-C camera, but now covering a bit more range and actually being able to focus, or rather the camera bodies being able to focus it wasn't necessarily the lens's problem entirely. I'm just delighted, because I do like to see APS-C systems able to work to their full extent, not be used as a sort of cynical marketing ploy to upsell you to full frame. APS-C, if well supported, does make sense as its own format, and lenses like the 17 to 40 f1.8 absolutely help in that.
We also saw, in the theme of sort of normal lenses, but that have something interesting or weird about them. We saw Sigma update the 35 f1.2 to make it much smaller and lighter. In fact, it's an f1.2 lens that you could actually feasibly carry around with you. And Canon releasing a 45mm f1.2 as well, which is kind of on the other end of the spectrum. It's nowhere near as sharp or has as good quality, but it is very cheap. I think it's under $400 or under $500, which is not something you necessarily expect from them, given where their lens range has been over the past couple of years. Nikon did a similar thing last year. So we're just seeing a lot of sort of groundwork lenses that are interesting in some way. And then we get to the lenses where you look at it and think, wouldn't have guessed that was coming out at all. In fact, I want to say Sigma started so many of their press releases this year with the first X to do Y. And they had the first 200mm f2 for mirrorless systems. My one statement on that lens is that it does somewhat, to me, seem like a lens searching for a body. It's something that you really want to put on a very fast sports-centered camera, but with the Sonys, it's going to be limited to 15 frames per second. And Panasonic doesn't really have a camera that plays in that market. You could get great results with it with an S1 II, but the buffer is going to fill quickly depending on what speed you're shooting at. So I don't know. Maybe Sigma can surprise us next year with the sports action cam.
I'm afraid you might have forgotten. I think you need an asterisk and a footnote for full frame mirrorless cameras as of such and such a date, because I think there's a Fujifilm 200mm f2 that predates it.
Good point. I did forget the full frame qualifier. I will say, yes, while Sigma did do this, they did also have like 4 or 5 qualifiers after that, just to make sure that they were really, really clear. It's like, it's if you are looking at this specific thing, it is the first.
Yeah, Mitchell, there's another Sigma lens this year that I think is worth a shout out that was unexpected and really interesting. And in fact, it was announced alongside the Sigma BF at the same launch event. And that was the 300 to 600 millimeter f4, which is, in my mind, look, this is not a travel lens. Definitely, if we're talking about travel, this thing is like carrying, a bazooka of some kind. But it's a really interesting lens from the standpoint that it's relatively fast for a telephoto. It's f4. It gets you what would normally require a couple of different lenses in terms of focal lengths. You've got a 300, you've got a 600, all in one lens. But then the amazing thing about it is US retail is $6,000. So if you think about getting effectively a 300 millimeter and a 600 millimeter f4 lens for $6,000, and by all accounts, it's a pretty good lens. I think that's pretty amazing, and not something I expected this year.
And probably something that no one has ever attached to the camera that it was announced alongside. I don't think a single picture has been taken with that lens attached to a VF.
It never even occurred to me to pair those two, but that could be an interesting experiment.
Yeah, and Sigma, had again, first mirrorless full frame autofocusing 135 f1.4, which is a massive portraiture lens. But I think the lens that I'd really like to give it to in terms of things that I wouldn't have expected but really enjoyed is the Sony 50-150 f2. It's just a really fast, wrist-breaking, but not as much as you would expect, zoom lens with a really fast aperture. And it takes a concept that we had seen before of a f2 zoom. Canon had a 28-70 f2, and so did Sony. But it puts it in a focal length that, at least to me, I think makes a little bit more sense and that I really, really enjoyed shooting with. OM had a 50-200 f2.8. And then even the lenses that we thought that we would generally be like, well, this is kind of boring, were interesting as well. Sigma had a 20-200 f3.5 to 6.3. And, typically a really, a zoom with a 10x focal range, maybe not going to be the most exciting thing ever, just by virtue of the fact that the quality isn't going to be the greatest. And on this one, it's not, but it is a full frame lens that is genuinely around the size of like a can of soda. Like when you look at it and pick it up, you think there's no way this could possibly be a full frame lens that goes from quite wide to very telephoto, and also doesn't look like you're looking through a screen door when you look at the pictures of it. And yet they did it. And Tamron did something very similar. I think there's a few reasons for why this may be, but I don't necessarily think it's the same reasons as the camera. Now, I know we were talking about this the other day amongst ourselves, and we've thought most manufacturers, their full frame or the mirrorless lens lineups are pretty complete. Can anyone else think of like lenses that are, obviously missing from anyone's lineup?
I was going to say, I'll call out one. Canon still lacks a really fast wide prime, like a 14 millimeter f1.8 or something of that ilk. That's the one obvious hole in the system, coming from the guy that likes to do astrophotography, of course.
And I think if you look across the lens lineups, some of the really niche lenses we used to see, like Canon for a long time made a series of tilt shift lenses. We've seen Fujifilm make some tilt shift lenses for its GFX medium format system, which actually makes a lot of sense for sort of architectural work and things. But I'm sort of surprised that we haven't seen tilt shifts arrive from Canon yet. And I think, but I think you have to start looking into really specific niches to start recognizing, okay, what's missing. So it's a question of, you either stray out into, uncharted, unusual territory as Sigma's doing, or you start to refresh and replace some of the existing optics. So I think it's going to be really hard to see what 2026 will bring.
I'd agree. I think there's also the factor of, in the past couple of years, the big story in lenses has been the rise of Chinese brands like Filtrox, TT Artisan, is it TT Artisan and 7 Artisans? There's some number of artisans with some prefixes, and one of them is plural and one of them is not.
7 Artisans is plural because there are 7 of them.
Oh, of course, yes. And then the TT is singular. And Laowa, Suri, all these brands that are making really good lenses, mostly primes, but nowadays they have autofocus and the quality is very good considering the price of them, and sometimes competitive with the best that some brands have to offer. And when you look at that, you think, well, gee, like what are companies like Canon and Nikon and Sony going to do? And it seems like the answer may be, well, they're going to start branching out into, kind of more divergent types of lenses that they maybe think they can still compete on, where, you're not looking at an E-mount. Let me get a 50 millimeter f1.8. Oh, there's a dozen options for my Sony camera.
Yeah, so some of those Chinese companies that you mentioned are definitely getting really creative in some of the lenses, and they're making some really good lenses. In fact, I would say the one thing we probably should have done before this call is we should have probably reviewed some of those lenses and taken a look at what has come out in the last year, because I think there were some really interesting optics that came out. And in fact, an interesting one that pops to mind right now, only because it just got announced a couple of days before we're recording this, is Viltrox announced a pair of attachment lenses for the Fujifilm X100 series. So for anyone who's not familiar, the Fujifilm X100, which is a fixed lens camera with it's a 23 millimeter lens, but it's effectively a 35 millimeter equivalent focal length. You can buy a pair of lenses from Fujifilm that either convert that to a 50 millimeter equivalent focal length or a 28 millimeter equivalent focal length. And they're very good. I actually have one for my Fujifilm X100 to go to 28 millimeter equivalent, but they're not cheap. I don't recall, there's 300, maybe more now, with
400 now.
Probably 400 now. I think Viltrox introduced a pair of these for what, $149 or $159 each or something like that, which makes that a much more accessible thing to owners of a Fujifilm X100. Now, we don't know how good they are yet. We'll have to wait for some data to come out about that. But assuming, it's quality optics like we've seen from some other Viltrox lenses, I think that's potentially changing the market for owners of that system.
So one thing that makes me hesitate to say that companies like Nikon and Canon and whatnot are going to start doing more niche things like tilt shift is that those Chinese manufacturers are also doing those niche things. We have seen tilt shift lenses from them. We've seen the probe lenses from Laowa. And so I have a hard time seeing those bigger companies invest in those niche lenses if they're already being made decently well by these third parties.
Yeah, I think you could be right. I think, we've seen, it's no surprise that, Canon has a very significant chunk of the professional market. It's no surprise that when they launched the RF mount, a lot of the lenses they started with first were their, top of the range L mount lenses aimed at professional users. And it might be that they decide to focus on, quality, predictable quality and reliability, and a service network and someone you can return the lens to if anything goes wrong, and then leave the odd quirky niches to third parties. It's just the fact that historically Canon did have a couple of tilt shifts that were popular professionally. I'd be surprised if they completely cede that ground to third parties. But I think that is the stage. A lot of lens lineups are starting to look pretty well stocked, and so it's going to be interesting to see what they do next.
To your points, Abby and Daryl, yeah, if you're looking for sort of out there unexpected lenses, Laowa is the one to watch. I think this year they had a full frame, very ultra wide zoom, to the point where by the time you're zoomed out to its widest end, you're getting very heavy vignetting. And then they looked at that and said, well, heck, let's put it on medium format too. And they've expanded the lineup of probe lenses. They've had tilt shift macros. They've had regular macros. That they've come out with a lot of stuff that you look at and you go, wow, that sure is something. Not all of it has autofocus, but hey, not all of it needs it.
Yeah, but I think between what we've seen from the sort of established manufacturers and camera makers, plus the contribution of the increasing number of third-party Chinese lens manufacturers, there's just been a dizzying array of lenses, some of which, as soon as it appears, you just think, why has no one ever made this before? And other ones you just think, why has anyone made this?
Period.
I think it supports your idea that, actually, 2025 has been, if nothing else, an interesting year.
It's going to be very interesting to see if that trend continues to 2026, or if everyone sort of got out all of their manic creative energy and we're going to see a more chill year for 25. Everyone, we're just doing version 2s for 2026. I wouldn't bet on that.
I hope not.